April 22nd, 1945. Deep beneath the shattered streets of Berlin, in the stale air of the Führerbunker, the war finally caught up with Adolf Hitler. The concrete ceiling hummed softly with the vibration of distant artillery. Each rumble filtered through layers of earth and reinforced steel. A low, constant growl like a storm that never moved on. The light in the conference room was yellow and tired, buzzing faintly. Cigarette smoke hung in the air, trapped like everything else down here. On the central table, the maps were already waiting. Creased, thumb-marked, stained with coffee rings and the faint smears of graphite. They sprawled across the wood in overlapping sheets, Eastern Front, Central Berlin, the Oder Line. Little colored flags were pinned into them. Red for Soviet formations, blue and black for German corps that no longer truly existed outside these walls. Hitler entered slowly, boots dragging just slightly, left hand trembling near the seam of his trousers. The dark hair now showed streaks of gray. His uniform jacket, once sharp, hung a little looser across his narrow shoulders. You can almost see how small he has become in the bunker light. Behind him trailed his usual shadow. Martin Bormann, eyes restless. Joseph Goebbels, thin and tense, and a few silent adjutants carrying folders and dispatch cases. The officers from the high command were already there. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, rigidly upright, General Wilhelm Burgdorf, grave, General Hans Krebs with his neat mustache and weary eyes. They stood as Hitler entered, heels clicking. "Sit," Hitler muttered, not quite looking at them, moving straight to the table. He lowered himself into the chair at the head of the maps, both hands resting on the edge for a moment, as if gathering strength. The tremor in his left hand grew worse. He tried to hide it by folding his hands together. The room settled into silence, broken only by the faint rattle of the ventilation fans and the distant boom of Soviet guns, closer than they had ever sounded before. "Report," Hitler said. It was Jodl who answered. It was almost always Jodl. "My Führer," he began, voice formal, clipped. "As of this morning, Soviet forces of Marshal Zhukov and Marshal Konev have completed the encirclement on the eastern and southern approaches. They are pressing into the suburbs of Berlin. Heavy artillery has been brought forward into direct range of the city center." Hitler nodded once, sharply. This was not new. They had been saying similar words for days now. Artillery, encirclement, Soviet pressure. He had always responded with directives, with orders for counterattacks that existed mostly on paper. "And Army Detachment Steiner?" Hitler asked, eyes still on the map, fixed on the little blue line near the north. The question fell into the air like something heavy. They had all known it was coming. They had been rehearsing the answer in their heads, dreading it. For hours now, aides and staff officers had passed along the same truth in fragments and guarded phrases. There would be no relief from the north. Krebs cleared his throat. A small sound in the close room. "My Führer," he began carefully, stepping closer to the table. "The situation for Steiner's units has deteriorated. The promised reinforcements have not arrived. His available forces are already engaged in defensive operations. An attack of the kind envisioned is no longer possible." Hitler's eyes finally left the maps and moved to Krebs. Slow, flat. "What do you mean?" he said softly. "No longer possible?" You can almost feel every head in the room tighten. "Waiting." Krebs glanced once at Jodl, who gave the slightest nod. "My Führer," Krebs repeated, choosing each word with care. "Army Detachment Steiner does not possess the strength to launch the ordered attack. The reserves intended to support him do not exist as effective formations. The last units have already been committed. There are no additional forces to draw upon. No reserves." Hitler asked. For a moment, the words hung there, as if he did not quite recognize them. Burgdorf stepped in, his voice lower, almost apologetic. "The Volkssturm units are exhausted or dispersed. Many have no heavy weapons. The SS battalions earmarked for the operation have been overrun or cut off during the Soviet advance. Our last armored reserves were lost in the fighting on the Silo Heights. He pointed gently to the map. Here, my Führer. And here. These divisions no longer exist as fighting forces. Hitler stared at the spots on the paper. His right hand reached out and touched a tiny blue flag as if he could will it back into reality. There had always been another reserve, another division, some hidden resource. For years, whenever the front seemed to crumble, someone had found more men, more guns, more time. Now the flags were just colored pins in old paper. Outside, another salvo of Soviet guns found its target. The bunker shivered. Dust drifted down in fine gray threads from a crack in the plaster. The electric lights flickered for a heartbeat, then steadied. No reserves, Hitler repeated, more to the table than to the men. Nothing that can alter the situation. Jodl answered, throat tight. The units on the map are either destroyed, encircled, or reduced to scattered groups of men. We no longer have the capacity to form a reliable striking force. Hitler's gaze shifted from face to face. Jodl, Krebs, Bergdorf, Goebbels. Nobody looked away, but nobody quite met his eyes either. For a long moment, there was only the ticking of the wall clock and the distant thunder of artillery. He sank back in his chair. You might expect shouting, one of the volcanic rages for which he was infamous. But it did not come. Not yet. Instead, his shoulders sagged, just slightly. So, he said, almost quietly, Steiner will not attack. The sentence was not a question anymore. Silence answered him. He looked again at the Eastern Front map. Red arrows pushed into Berlin from every direction, their tips almost touching the small circle marking the government quarter. The Thousand-Year Reich, promised so often and so loudly, was now reduced to a shrinking island of ruin and fire. How far are they from here? Hitler asked. Artillery is within 4 kilometers of the city center. Krebs replied. Some Soviet spearheads have already reached the outskirts. Street fighting has begun in several districts. 4 kilometers. A brisk walk, if the streets above had not been transformed into a landscape of craters and rubble. Hitler pressed his fingers to his temples. His eyes closed for a moment, jaw working. When he opened them again, something was different. The wild, fierce certainty that had carried him through every setback, every reversal, was flickering. They have lied to me, he murmured. All of them, the generals, the commanders, always reports of reserves, of new formations, illusions. No one answered. What could they say? The illusions had not been theirs alone. For the first time, he let his gaze wander past the maps, past the flags, to the bare concrete walls, to the buzzing light, to the men who had followed him down into this underground grave. The war is lost, he said. The words were barely above a whisper, but in the cramped room they sounded louder than the artillery. It was not a strategic assessment, not a dramatic outburst. It was a simple, belated acknowledgement of what every man around the table had known for days. In that instant, as the bunker trembled under another distant impact and the smoke curled lazily toward the ceiling, the vision of a thousand-year Reich did not shatter in one grand explosion. It simply collapsed inward, like a building whose foundations had been quietly eaten away, leaving only dust and echoes. Outside, the guns kept speaking for the Red Army. Inside, the man who had unleashed the war sat hunched over maps of armies that no longer existed, staring at a future that now stopped at the concrete walls around him. For several seconds after he said it, nobody moved. The war is lost. You could almost believe the words might vanish if everyone simply pretended not to hear them. The clock on the wall ticked on, each second heavy. Somewhere above, another artillery round landed with a hollow thump that rolled through the concrete like a distant drum beat. Then Hitler pushed his chair back The legs scraped loudly on the floor. He stood so abruptly that his hand shot out to steady himself on the table. The tremor in his fingers was worse now, the knuckles white against the edge of the map. "Out," he said suddenly. "All of you. Out. Leave me with the staff." The ministers and civilians were the first to retreat. Goebbels backed away, eyes wide and luminous behind his spectacles, one hand clutching his notebook to his chest. Bormann slipped out sideways, already whispering to an adjutant. The door opened and closed, letting in a brief breath of corridor air that smelled of sweat and wet wool before sealing again. Only the senior officers remained. Krebs, Jodl, Bergdorf, a few adjutants along the wall, trying to look smaller than their uniforms. Hitler stared at them, breathing through his nose, short and sharp. The muscles in his jaw worked like he was chewing something that would not break. "So," he said, voice rising, "for weeks you have promised reserves. You have sent me reports. New divisions, new battalions. What are they now, ghosts on paper?" Jodl started to answer, but Hitler cut him off, his words tumbling over one another. "Traitors, incompetents, cowards. All of you. You let the Russians come to Berlin. You let them surround the capital of the Reich. After all the sacrifices, all the victories, you lose everything like this." His hand swept across the map, scattering pins. A blue flag rolled to the floor and vanished between two boot heels. If Steiner had attacked, Hitler snapped. If Wenck had moved from the south, if the army had shown just a fraction of the will of our people, this would not have happened. You have all betrayed me. You have betrayed Germany. There had been rants before, storms that blew through the bunker like gales. This one was different. The volume was there, the venom, but beneath it you can hear something else now, a raw edge that sounds like fear. Krebs stood stiffly at attention, face drained. He knew the truth better than anyone. He had seen the reports from the front, the scraps of units trying to hold impossible lines against entire Soviet armies. He had spoken with commanders who led companies that had once been regiments. There was nothing left to move. "My Führer." Jodl tried again. "We have done everything possible with the forces available. The men at the front are fighting to the last. Many units have been wiped out in their positions. There are no reserves because they have already died." "Died?" Hitler spat. "Died because of your failures. Because not one of you had the courage to defy the pessimists and hold the line. The people have shown more courage than the army. Old men, boys, women in the factories. But you," he jabbed a finger at the row of shoulders and medals, "you have failed me." His voice cracked on the last word. If you had been standing in the corridor outside at that moment, you would have seen orderlies and clerks paused in their work, heads tilted, listening to the muffled roar from behind the door. A young communication operator, headphones around his neck, stared at the wall as if he could see through it. Typists in the next room let their fingers rest for a moment on the keys of their machines. The staff had heard shouts before. They had felt rages shake the air. But they had also heard something else a few minutes earlier, carried down the corridor like a rumor that grows teeth. The war is lost. Above their heads, Berlin was coming apart on the surface. Soviet 152mm guns were smashing entire facades from buildings with each shot. Streets that had once seen parades now lay choked with bricks, shattered glass, and the twisted skeletons of burned-out trams. The air smelled of plaster dust, smoke, and something else darker that clung to the back of the throat. In cellars and basements, civilians huddled on benches, baked potatoes passing from hand to hand, candles flickering in bottles. The walls vibrated with every nearby impact, sprinkling them with fine powder. Somewhere a child cried. Somewhere a man in a worn field-grey jacket adjusted the strap of a Panzerfaust and waited by a window for the shape of a tank to appear at the end of the street. Hitler had once promised them a realm that would last 1,000 years. On this April afternoon, that promise had less than 10 days left. Back in the conference room, the storm finally burned down. Hitler sank slowly back into his chair, shoulders rounded, eyes staring at nothing just ahead of him. His breathing was ragged, the anger having taken something from him that did not come back as quickly as it once had. Nobody spoke. The seconds ticked by. The guns outside continued their slow, relentless pounding. At last, he said, in a flat voice, "If the war is lost, it is because the German people have proved themselves unworthy of me. If they cannot win, they deserve to perish." It was not a tactical statement. It was a verdict on an entire nation, delivered by a man in a room with no windows. The officers shifted slightly, but no one challenged him. He looked up at Krebs. "Send for Keitel and the others," he said. "We will issue new orders. Berlin will be defended to the last cartridge. There will be no surrender. I will remain in the capital. I will not leave Berlin." That, at least, they all believed. As the meeting broke up, chairs scraping, boots moving toward the door. You can imagine one detail that would not have made it into any official record, the way some of the men avoided looking at the maps as they passed, as if the colored arrows might reach up and accuse them. They no longer needed the charts to know what was coming. In the narrow corridor outside, the air was warmer, more crowded. Eva Braun crossed paths with Krebs as she came down from the upper rooms, dressed neatly despite the hour, a hint of perfume clinging to her. She gave him a small, uncertain smile. He answered with a stiff nod. Even here, routine still tried to cling on. Meals were served at regular times. Coffee was poured. Telephones rang with less and less to say. But in the heart of the bunker, the moment had already passed when illusion ended. Hitler had said the words out loud. No number of new orders could pull them back. Above, the city burned its way toward evening. Evening slid into the bunker, not with sunset, but with the simple turning of clocks and the serving of the next meal. Upstairs, somewhere above the layers of concrete and steel, the sky over Berlin darkened behind a veil of smoke. Fires painted the low clouds orange. Searchlights probed for bombers that rarely came now, replaced by the earthbound storm of Soviet artillery down below. The lamps burned the same tired yellow. Time here was not measured in daylight, but in reports and explosions and the slow crumbling of hope. The dinner that night in Hitler's private room was more subdued than usual. Eva Braun sat at his right, smiling when he looked her way, carefully ignoring the tremor in his left hand as he lifted his fork. She had dressed with the same care as ever, hair done, blouse pressed, as if they were still at the Berghof and the Alps lay outside the window instead of 15 meters of soil and reinforced concrete. To his left, Goebbels talked about the will of the people, about sacrifice, about faith in final victory. His words flowed in that smooth, almost hypnotic rhythm he had used so often in speeches. Only now, if you listened closely, you could hear how they sometimes faltered for half a beat before finding their pace again. The food came on real plates, carried by orderlies who tried to keep their hands steady. There was still meat, still vegetables, bottled wine, somewhere. Supply lines continued to trickle supplies into this underground island while the city above starved on cabbage soup and bitter coffee made from roasted barley. Hitler played with his food more than he ate it. He listened with half an ear as Goebbels described the latest propaganda broadcasts. The calls to the Volkssturm to fight to the last, the stories of heroism in the rubble. It was the kind of thing that once would have roused him, fed his sense of destiny. Now his thoughts kept drifting back to the words in the conference room. No reserves. The war is lost. At one point, he put down his fork and knife and simply stared at the tablecloth. The others fell quiet, waiting. You might imagine the scene: a small group around a dining table that has become an altar to ritual. Plates, cups, folded napkins. The hum of the ventilation, the deep, distant growl of artillery, a faint shudder that passes through the chair legs with each closer impact. Finally, he said, more to himself than to anyone else, "They have left me without armies." Goebbels seized on the comment. "My Führer, the people are your army now," he said quickly. "They will fight in every street, from every window, from every cellar. History will remember this as Germany's greatest hour." Hitler gave him a tired look. "History," he muttered, "will remember only that we failed." Eva reached out, brushing her fingers lightly over the back of his hand. "You have given so much," she said softly. "No one could have done more. If they had followed your orders, if they had shown your will, things would be different." She meant to comfort him, and in a way she did. But underneath her words lay the same acknowledgement everyone in this room now carried, whether they spoke it or not. There would be no miracle. After dinner, the routine continued. Reports from the front, telegrams, desperate messages from commanders in the city, asking for instructions that no longer had real meaning. In the map room, the red pins edged even closer to the center. One officer, working late with a pencil and ruler, paused for a moment as he realized that one Soviet formation's marked artillery range now easily reached the Reich Chancellery above their heads. He rubbed tired eyes, then quietly adjusted the scale of the map. It did not really help. Later, close to midnight, Hitler retired to his small study. The room was claustrophobic even by bunker standards. A desk with scattered papers, a few chairs, a portrait on the wall. The air smelled faintly of stale cigar smoke and the ink from the reports piled on the table. At the door, his two secretaries, Gerda Christian and Traudl Junger, waited with notebooks and pencils. "You may go and rest," he told them, voice unexpectedly gentle. "There will be fewer dictations from now on." They exchanged a quick, startled glance. For months they had written his words as he dictated them at all hours, speeches and orders and statements that flew out of the bunker across the crumbling Reich. "Are you sure, my Führer?" Traudl asked carefully. He considered her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "There is little left to say." When they were gone, he sat alone at the desk, the lamp pooling light across the scattered maps and documents. Outside the door, an SS guard shifted his weight from one foot to the other, boots creaking softly. Inside, Hitler reached slowly into a drawer and took out a small metal object that lay on a folded napkin, a cyanide capsule. He turned it over between thumb and forefinger, watching how it caught the light. The tiny, fragile thing looked absurd against his broad, calloused fingers, yet it carried more certainty than any order he could now give to imaginary armies. 1,000 years. He had promised them once. A Reich that would outlast all enemies, all setbacks, all treaties and alliances. Now its future could be measured in how quickly the Soviets could fight their way through rubble and fortified cellars. How long the last defenders could hold stairwells and intersections. He put the capsule back on the napkin, folded the cloth once, and returned it to the drawer. When he spoke, it was barely a whisper, meant for no one. It will not last the month. He did not need a calendar to know spring had only just begun. The chestnut trees that lined Berlin's avenues would be putting out new leaves above ground, turning streets into tunnels of soft green whenever the smoke cleared. Children should have been walking beneath them with satchels and skipping ropes. Instead, the city was dying under the weight of a war he had unleashed. In that moment, for the first time, he allowed himself to picture the map not as lines and symbols, but as real space, real streets, real buildings that would be occupied by Soviet troops within days. No reserves, no miracle. The Reich that was supposed to stretch for centuries would not even see another season change. Outside the study, footsteps approached. An adjutant knocked softly, then entered when called. Another report. "My Führer," he said, holding out a flimsy sheet. "From General Weidling, The ammunition stocks inside Berlin are running low. He requests guidance. Hitler took the paper, eyes scanning the words without really seeing them. Then he put it aside. "Tell him," he said quietly, "to fight as long as he has bullets. After that, they are to fight with their fists." The adjutant saluted and withdrew. The door clicked shut. For a few seconds more, Hitler sat motionless. Then he leaned forward, elbows on the desk, and buried his face in his hands as the guns of the Red Army continued their slow counting down of his promised 1,000 years. By the next morning, the bunker had adjusted to a new kind of normal. The sentence that had hung in the air the previous day now lived unspoken in every glance and gesture. The war is lost. Yet routine marched stubbornly on. Telephones still rang. Runners still carried folded messages up and down the corridor. The kitchen still prepared breakfast. The guards still checked papers at every door, as if any of it could keep reality from pressing in with the artillery. In the Situation Room, the maps had been carefully rearranged. Loose pins gathered, bent ones discarded, new ones forced into fraying cork. An adjutant had smoothed the worst of the creases, erasing where Hitler's hand had slammed down the day before. When he entered, shortly after 10, the men straightened automatically. He looked smaller than he had even a week before. Movements slower, but his eyes were clearer than they had been in days. It was as if something had hardened inside him overnight. The despair was still there, but layered over it now sat something colder. "Report," he said. Krebs went through the familiar litany. Soviet penetration into new districts, loss of key intersections, ammunition shortages, the collapse of this regiment, the encirclement of that strong point. Every line of the front now pressed directly against the city's skin. Hitler listened, face unreadable. "And the Western Allies?" he asked suddenly. It was the question that still hung over the map, like a ghost of possibilities that no longer existed. American and British forces are advancing from the west and southwest. Jodl replied. They are across the Elbe in several places. There has been no indication they intend to move toward Berlin. In another reality, he might have tried to bargain, to play one enemy against another. He had gambled on that more than once in his career. Now even that option was gone. Berlin was a Soviet prize. Then they will let the Bolsheviks destroy the capital of the Reich, Hitler said flatly. They are all cowards. He stared down at the central map of Berlin for a long moment. Colored grease pencils circled the government quarter, marking defensive sectors. Little arrows indicated probable Soviet thrusts. Every street had become a potential killing ground. Every bridge a last stand. He traced a line with his finger along Unter den Linden, past the Brandenburg Gate, up toward the Tiergarten, then tapped once near the spot that represented the Chancellery Gardens. Here, he said, this is where it ends. No one challenged him. Instead, he began to issue orders. They came out in a calm, almost detached stream. Consolidate these units. Pull that group back to form a reserve. Fictional though it was. Hold this bridge at all costs. No unauthorized withdrawals. Any commander who abandons his position without direct orders is to be shot. Total resistance, he said. Every street, every building. If the German people will not defend their capital, they deserve extinction. Behind the clinical language, the staff could hear what he was really doing, not changing the outcome, only shaping the manner of the fall. Later, in a smaller meeting, the conversation turned to the fate of Berlin's infrastructure. Speer's name came up, his arguments against destroying what remained of Germany's industry and cities. He had pleaded that something must be left for the survivors, that not all must be sacrificed to a scorched earth. Hitler's face twisted. I gave the order that everything be destroyed, he said sharply. If the war is lost, it is because the people have failed. They must bear the consequences. There is no future for a nation that cannot win. The Thousand-Year Reich had become In his mind, a test that Germany had failed. If it could not endure fire, then it did not deserve to continue at all. Outside the bunker, that fire burned unchecked. Soviet soldiers advanced through choking dust and flying plaster, tank tracks grinding over fallen tram rails. Machine gun nests flashed from cellar windows. Panzerfaust teams darted from doorways, fired, then fled through holes knocked in interior walls. Every block was an argument written in smoke and blood. Within this chaos, in a quiet office beneath the Chancellery garden, Hitler sat with Bormann and Goebbels and discussed not strategy, but legacy. There must be a political testament, Goebbels urged. Something to explain to the German people, to history, why this has happened, to show that you remained faithful to your mission to the end. History will be written by the victors, Hitler answered dryly. They will not care for my explanations. Yet even as he said it, the idea took root. If the Reich would not last 1,000 years, perhaps his version of its story might linger a little longer. By afternoon, the distant rumble of guns had changed tone. It was no longer just the heavy thud of artillery. Sometimes now there was the sharper, rattling crackle of closer fighting, the cough of tank guns, the dull, hollow boom of detonated buildings. In the communications room, reports from within the city began to sound less like military dispatches and more like cries from a sinking ship. We have 5 shells left for our last anti-tank gun. We are surrounded in the cellar of the courthouse. No way out. Request permission to fall back 2 streets to a more defensible line. Each time, the answer that came from the bunker was the same. Hold your position, when one commander finally added, for how long? The reply was brief, until the end. That evening, over a simple meal, the conversation turned to the possibility of leaving Berlin. Bormann mentioned it first, drafting the suggestion in the cautious language of logistics and contingency. Aircraft could still land at improvised strips. There were routes to the south. They could establish a new command center in the Alps, continue resistance there, a national redoubt, as the rumors had called it. For a moment, you might have thought Hitler was considering it. He sipped watered wine, eyes half closed. Then he shook his head. No, he said, I will not crawl like a beggar through the villages of Bavaria. My place is here in Berlin. I will fall in the capital of the Reich. Eva watched him as he said it, her expression unreadable, then gave a small nod as if some private decision inside her had just been confirmed. The men around the table understood what his refusal truly meant. If he would not leave Berlin, and Berlin would not survive the month, then there was only one path left that he would accept for himself. He had tested the idea with the cyanide capsule in his hand the night before. Now, with each passing hour, the thought settled more firmly into place. The Reich that was supposed to see centuries was now being measured in days, perhaps hours. And in the bunker beneath its dying capital, the man who had once believed history itself, bent to his will, had begun to plan not how to save it, but how to frame its collapse and choose the manner of his own exit. The days that followed bled into one another like ink on damp paper. No one in the bunker talked openly about dates anymore, but the wall calendars still existed, their pages flipped by habit. Each morning, an adjutant's hand moved another small black cross over a square marked April. Above ground, the Soviet ring tightened, street by ruined street. Below, Hitler's universe had shrunk to a handful of rooms, a constant dull thunder, and the clatter of typewriters that no longer announced decrees of conquest, but fragments of a finale. It was late when the next blow arrived. In the communications room, under bare bulbs and a haze of cigarette smoke, a radio operator pulled off his headphones and stared at the flimsy sheet just handed to him. The message had come from the north, from the Swedish city of Lund, then bounced and relayed until it reached this exhausted man beneath Berlin. It spoke of Himmler, He carried it down the corridor at a half-trot, knuckles white around the paper. The SS guard stepped aside. At the door to the study, he paused, gathered himself, then knocked. Inside, Hitler was hunched over the desk, a half-empty cup of cold tea beside his hand. Bormann stood near the wall, going through a stack of documents. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the room itself sensed what was about to enter it. "My Führer," the operator said. Voice tight. "A report has arrived. From foreign broadcasts, concerning Reichsführer SS Himmler." Hitler's head lifted a fraction. "Himmler," he repeated, as if the name belonged to a different world now. "What of Himmler?" The paper crackled slightly as it changed hands. As he read, the little color left in his face seemed to drain away. The report was simple. Almost clinical. Heinrich Himmler, architect of terror, head of the SS, had allegedly opened negotiations with the Western Allies through Swedish intermediaries. He had suggested surrender in the West while continuing the fight against the Soviets in the East. For years, Himmler had been one of his most fanatical followers, a symbol of the iron loyalty Hitler demanded. Now, at the edge of the abyss, he was proposing to strike a separate deal while the capital burned. "So," Hitler said slowly, eyes still on the paper. "Even Himmler." Bormann waited, almost holding his breath. "He has betrayed me," Hitler whispered. The words were quiet, but his hand clenched so tightly around the flimsy sheet that it tore. The tremor that ran along his arm this time had nothing to do with illness. "Himmler," he said again, louder. "The man I trusted completely. The man I believed incapable of disloyalty. A traitor." The wave of rage that followed was almost a relief to those around him. It was familiar, expected, something they knew how to stand through. He struck the desk with his fist, sent an inkpot tumbling, cursed Himmler, the SS, the entire world that had failed to match his idea of loyalty. But beneath the explosion lay something deeper and more corrosive. If even Himmler was trying to find a way out, then the last faint hope that some secret plan, some hidden resource might still exist flickered and went dark. The Thousand-Year Reich had not only failed to reach its promised span, in its final days, the inner circle was devouring itself. "From this moment," Hitler said harshly, "Himmler is dismissed from all his offices. He is to be regarded as a traitor. I forbid any contact with him. If he is found, he is to be arrested, if possible shot." Bormann nodded rapidly, already thinking of how to phrase the announcement. In the next room, a typewriter came to life with renewed frenzy as a decree was hammered into official form. The keys clacked out the fall of a man who had once helped build the machinery of the regime, now cast out in its dying hours. A little later, another report arrived, this one from Italy. Mussolini was dead. The Italian leader, once his ally, had been captured by partisans while trying to flee, shot, and hung upside down in a public square. The body had been beaten, spat upon, riddled with bullets. Hitler listened in silence as the details were read. An image came unbidden himself, dragged from a car by enemy hands, displayed in some Berlin plaza, the mob taking out 12 years of fear and fury on his lifeless body. The thought did not frighten him exactly. It offended something in him that still demanded control, even over death. When the report finished, he nodded once. "That," he said, "will not happen to me." It was around this point that talk of a testament turned into action. Seated at a small table, Traudl Junge placed a fresh sheet of paper in her machine and waited, fingers resting lightly on the keys. Across from her, in his chair, Hitler began to dictate. The words came slowly at first, then more surely. He spoke of his rise, of the party, of the war. He blamed the generals for the defeat, the people for weakness, the Jews for everything. He named his successors, reshuffled titles for a future government that would never sit in power. It was less a message to Germany than a final attempt to control the narrative of his own life. At one point, he paused, eyes unfocused, listening to a nearby explosion that sent a faint tremor through the lamp on the table. "The fight continues," he said then, almost mechanically, dictating the phrase out of habit. But his tone stripped it of any conviction. Even as he said that the struggle would go on, he had already chosen the moment when it would end for him. When the testament was complete, he signed it with a hand that shook so badly an adjutant had to steady the paper. "Make several copies," he ordered. "They must reach our lines." The irony hung in the air. There were almost no lines left to reach. That night, he summoned Eva Braun. In the dim light of his sitting room, the furnishings looked even more tired than before. Yet he had changed into a darker tunic, and she wore a simple but elegant dress, as if preparing for a small, private ceremony rather than the prologue to tragedy. A city official had been found, an old party loyalist with the authority to register a marriage. He stood stiffly by the table, shuffling forms, pen in hand. It happened quietly, almost awkwardly. No music, no flowers. Just a few witnesses, the muffled boom of artillery, and 2 signatures on a paper that should have begun a life together instead of ending one. Afterward, Eva smiled up at him, her eyes bright with a strange mix of happiness and absolute knowledge. She had chosen to stay when others begged her to leave. Now, with the ceremony complete, she had bound herself to his fate in a way no one could ignore. Later still, in the narrow corridor, word of the marriage spread in low tones. Some of the staff shook their heads, others wiped at their eyes. It was an absurdly human act in the middle of a catastrophe that had cost millions of lives. Yet down here, where the world had contracted to concrete and fear, it mattered. In his study once more, the cyanide capsules were brought out again. The doctor explained their effect with clinical calm. One was tested on Blondie, the beloved German shepherd. The dog's collapse on the floor sent a visible shudder through Hitler that no report of lost divisions had managed. He knelt beside her, hand hovering over her fur, then withdrew it. Even loyalty, that pure, could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. As the night deepened and the guns grew closer, the shape of the end became clear, even to those who had avoided thinking it fully through. The Thousand-Year Reich had already died in the maps and reports. Soon, its founder would follow, not in battle, not in captivity, but in a self-chosen exit a few meters from the table where he had once promised eternity. The calendar on the bunker wall read April 30th, 1945. Someone had drawn a thin pencil line through the previous day, a habit carried over from quieter years. Now the neat grid of squares had almost no meaning. Outside, the Soviet artillery did not care what day it was. The guns simply fired and reloaded, moving a little closer with every hour. In the early morning, the bunker shook hard enough to rattle cups on shelves. Dust drifted from a seam in the ceiling above the corridor. An electric bulb swung slightly on its wire. In the Situation Room, the lamps trembled and one of the pinned maps slid sideways, held only by a last red flag sticking out of the cork. The assault on the government quarter had begun in earnest. Hitler emerged from his bedroom looking as if he had aged 10 years in one night. His uniform was still neat, but it hung on him. The skin beneath his eyes was bruised and sagging. His left hand trembled so badly that he kept it pressed against his thigh as he walked. He went first to the map room out of habit. There were hardly any blue or black pins left now. Red dominated the board. The Soviet arrows had spilled over the spree, pushed around the Tiergarten, closed like a fist around the center. Krebs stood near the map, fingers resting on the edge of the table as if to steady himself. "They are at the Reichstag," he reported quietly. "There is heavy fighting in the cellars and on the staircases. Our units are nearly out of ammunition. Some have resorted to hand grenades and bayonets. Hitler looked at the red cluster around the Reichstag symbol, then let his gaze drift to the small circle that represented the Chancellery and the bunker beneath it. "They are here," he said, "in the heart of the city." "Yes, my Führer," Krebs answered. There were no new plans to offer, no counterattack maps to unfurl. The fiction of relief forces had died with Steiner's non-existent attack days ago. What remained was only a question of time and distance, a few streets, a few courtyards, a few stairwells. Hitler straightened slowly. "In a few hours," he said, as much to himself as to the men around him. "They will be here in this building. They will tear down every symbol of the Reich. They will hang their flag over the ruins." He had always imagined his Reich stretching far into the future, a line of banners and parades disappearing into some hazy golden horizon. Now that vision snapped into something brutally short and clear. April 30th. It would not live to see May. Later that morning, he summoned several of his closest staff and officers to the conference room for what everyone understood, even if no one said it aloud, would be the last time. They gathered in a rough semicircle. Goebbels, pale and intense. Bormann, eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. Generals in creased uniforms. Secretaries with notebooks they knew they would not need. Hitler addressed them without ceremony. "I will stay in Berlin," he said. "I will not fall into the hands of the enemy. I have decided to remain here and end my life when the time comes." The words were simple, delivered in that flat tone he had acquired in the last days. The tone that did not ask for agreement. "I have ordered that my body and that of my wife are to be burned," he continued. "The enemy will not have us for their spectacle. You will all do your duty. Those who can break out should try to reach our lines. The fight must continue wherever there are Germans who can still resist." There was no cheer, no chorus of assent. Only a few strained nods and murmurs of "Jawohl, mein Führer," spoken out of reflex rather than conviction. If you had been standing there, you might have noticed the small things. How Eva Braun, now officially his wife, kept her back straight, her hands folded, her smile faint but steady. How the secretaries stared at the floor rather than at his face. How one of the SS guards by the door swallowed hard, Adam's apple bobbing above his collar. After dismissing most of them, he spoke briefly with Goebbels. The propaganda minister insisted that he and his family would stay. "I belong where you are, my Führer," he said. "If you remain in Berlin, I remain. My wife and children as well." Hitler did not argue. He had no energy left to push anyone away from the fate he had chosen for himself. Then came the final, smaller ritual. In his study, with the cheap lamp casting a tired circle of light on the desk, Hitler called in each of his remaining staff, one by one or in small groups, to say farewell. Traudl Junge entered with Gerda Christian, their notebooks tucked under their arms out of habit. He told them they had done well, that they should try to escape when the chance came. "You are still young," he said. "You might yet have a life after this. I'm sorry I can no longer help you." It was the closest thing to an apology any of them would ever hear. He shook hands with officers who had followed him through victories and defeats, who had believed in the Thousand-Year Reich and now stood amid its rubble. To some he muttered a few formal words, to others, nothing at all, simply gripping their fingers with a dry, shaking hand. Outside the door, those who had already said their farewells stood in a dazed cluster. A few wiped tears away with the backs of their hands. Others simply stared at the concrete wall, listening to the muffled roar of battle that was now almost constant overhead. In the cramped bedroom he shared with her now in these last days, Hitler and Eva ate a light midday meal. Pasta, a bit of vegetable, a small dessert. The table was laid properly. Eva made a joke about the sauce, and for a moment he almost smiled. When the plates were cleared, he checked his watch. It was early afternoon. The decision he had glimpsed in the softness of night with a cyanide capsule in his hand days before. The moment he had admitted to himself that the Reich would not survive the spring had turned into a schedule. They moved to the sitting room next to his study. Eva changed into a dark dress. Hitler put on his worn, familiar tunic. Outside, in the corridor, the staff gathered, summoned for a final farewell. You can imagine the narrow space filled with faces, the air thick with sweat, fear, and something like disbelief. He walked along the line, nodding, offering quick handshakes. Some people clicked their heels. Some murmured his title. A few could not speak at all. At the end of the corridor, near the door to the small conference room, he paused, turned, and raised his right hand in a gesture that had once commanded stadiums. "Thank you," he said. It was not a speech, not a declaration, just two words hanging in the stale air. Then he and Eva went back into the study. The door closed softly behind them. Outside, time stretched thin. Minutes felt like hours. The staff waited, held in a silence so complete that every other sound seemed magnified. The scuff of a boot, the faint jingle of metal on an officer's belt, the distant, ceaseless pounding of artillery as Soviet troops fought their way closer through the ruins. Inside the study, Eva sat on the couch. Hitler took the armchair by the table. She bit into her cyanide capsule first, according to what those nearby later pieced together. He watched, jaw tight, as the poison did its work. Then he brought the pistol up. The sound, when it came, was sharp and contained, swallowed quickly by concrete and insulation. But in the corridor outside, every head snapped up, every spine stiffened. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Bormann and a few others rushed to the door. It opened onto a scene that would never be recorded in official reports, with all its details. The two bodies, the smell of cordite and bitter almonds, the silence that followed. The instructions were clear, wrapped in blankets, carried up narrow stairs to the garden that had once seen receptions and photographs. The bodies were laid in a shell crater near the entrance. The air outside hit the bearers like a physical blow, full of smoke and dust and the raw crackle of nearby gunfire. They doused the bodies with petrol. Hands shook striking matches in the erratic wind. At last, flame caught, ran hungrily along fabric and hair. The fire climbed, consuming what was left of the couple who had just sat in a lamplit room beneath the earth. Around the edges of the crater, a small ring of figures stood at a distance, faces lit by fire and the occasional flash of a nearby explosion. Some saluted, some simply stared. Above them, the sky over Berlin churned with smoke and shrapnel. There, in that shallow, burning hole in a ruined garden, the Thousand-Year Reich finally ended. It had not lasted 50 years, or even 20. In the end, it had come down to a man in a bunker saying, "The war is lost," a calendar that would not see May under his rule, and a handful of loyalists watching flames struggle in the wind while the Red Army closed in on the last streets of a dying city.